So welcome. It's really great to be here in this virtual space with you three. This evening, we're going to be talking about two countries with two climate stories. Australia and Russia may seem like really different countries, but we actually have a lot in common when it comes to climate change. So tonight we're going to be sharing some stories about those similarities and differences and what we can learn from each other. My name's James Whitmore. I'm a writer and journalist based in Melbourne. I've previously been an editor at The Conversation. I produced radio for 3CR Community Radio. In 2015, I co-authored a book called The Handbook, Surviving and Living with Climate Change. My co-host is Angelina Davidova. She's the director of the Office of Environmental Information, which works in the area of cooperation between Russia and other countries in the climate and environmental sectors. She's also one of the leading climate journalists in Russia, and she regularly contributes to Russian and international media. She teaches at a number of universities in Russia, and she's a renowned public speaker and expert on climate topics in Russia. Dr. Alexei Kokrin is the director of Climate and Energy Program at WWF Russia. Previously worked in the Institute of Global Climate and Ecology of the Russian Hydrometeorology Agency and Academy of Science, including as leading scientist. He has been a lead author and contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, for which he and other report authors were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And Professor Will Steffen here in Australia. He is Emeritus Professor at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University, where he has previously served as director and was also the inaugural director at the university's Climate Change Institute. He has advised the Australian government on climate change and climate science, and he is a climate counsellor at the Climate Council. So let's get right into it. And I want to ask you both about each country's most recent summers, because they have seen some truly extreme weather. So Alexei, starting with you, can you tell us what has happened over the most recent Russian summer?
Actually, Russia is a large country, as well as Australia, but maybe Russia is more diverse in different climatic conditions. However, the common thing that climate is more unstable, or as I like to repeat after the famous scientists in atmosphere science, climate is more nervous. So it's not more continental or more marine climate, it's more nervous climate. And everybody now do agree that it's really the case. It's really the case. Yeah, and in some areas it's very hot periods. Maybe it's not so hot as in Australian scale, but if they have plus 30 in Yakutia or northern Yakutia, what is Arctic, it's very, very abnormal. In this year, they had even very seldom event of thunder fire. It's not forest fire, thunder fire. Yeah, it was so dry and hot. So, and in some other areas, they have as forest fire as usual, what is our big headache in Russia. Yeah, especially that in many areas, no extinguishing is at all. It's very remote areas, yeah. Speaking about central part, the majority of people are living. Yeah, maybe this year situation is a bit better because many people due to COVID disappear from large megapolises to rural areas. In rural areas, heat wave is more modest, as you know, yeah. So maybe this year is not the best illustration of damage from heat waves or abnormal precipitations, yeah. However, anyway, people feel it, people discuss it, and as I now far from Moscow, they discuss it very seriously as well. So not only in Moscow, St. Petersburg, but in absolutely rural areas, and actually quite poor people discuss and try to do something about not only classic ecology, what is forest fires or pollution of water or air, but they also discuss climate. Sometimes in very naive phrases, but discuss, it's already a good step forward.
Thanks, Alexei. And Will, I just wanted to ask you, can you tell us about Australia, what is now known as Australia as the Black Summer?
Yeah, this was extraordinary, and it was dominated by bushfires. And a lot of aspects of the fires were quite remarkable. They began extremely early in the season in August, September, which is just the end of winter up in Queensland. And during the summer, they spread further south burning enormous areas. So to give you an idea, some of the statistics coming out of these fires were that on an average year, of course, we do have fires naturally in Australia. In an average year, about 2%, 2 to 3% of Eastern Australian forests burned. This year, 21% burnt. This is extraordinary and for anywhere in the world, and certainly for Australia. But the damage was enormous, both from the fires themselves and from the smoke. Between 450 and 500 people lost their lives in the fires, directly from the fires and from the smoke. We estimated that about 3 billion animals were burnt to death because the fires were so intense, so fast moving, that they simply couldn't be controlled. The animals couldn't get out of the way fast enough. Horrific scenes of koalas and kangaroos being burnt to death. There was no way, even though we have some of the best firefighters in the world, there was no way that they could contain these fires. They were so big, so intense, generating their own weather, their own tornadoes. It was quite a remarkable summer. I was in Canberra during the summer, and although Canberra itself wasn't burnt, we suffered a lot of the smoke. And on one day in January, we had the highest level of air pollution in the world, even beating out some of the Indian cities for that. But it was very nerve-wracking because we were having fires closing in on the city of Canberra. Fires were only about 7 or 8 kilometers to the south. We could see them from the suburbs, massive flames. And we were put on notice to evacuate. But when you think, well, all right, that's a good idea. But then when you realize there are 3 roads going out of Canberra, 2 of those 3 were already cut by fire. So you have 500,000 people who potentially would have to get on one road to try to get out. It would have been a disaster. Fortunately, the wind shifted just in time and we were saved. But the damage was horrendous. I think a lot of people are still suffering mental depression and shock from this. And I should just say, obviously, the fingerprint of climate change was all over these fires. Leading up to them, we had a couple of years of exceptionally dry weather, particularly in the southeast, unusually dry. So the forests were tinder dry. And then we had an exceptionally hot summer in 2019, 2020. And so climate change was behind both of these meteorological factors, which conditioned the forest to burn.
Alexei, I wonder if you could respond to the human impacts of some of those Siberian fires that you were talking about. Is there the same impact in terms of smoke and pollution and things like that?
Sure, smoke is the main problem because smoke damages huge territories. Direct impact of fire is significant, but it's quite local. Maybe one a bit more privilege of Siberia in comparison, let's say California. My son is living in California, I can compare, yes? In California, many buildings or log cabins inside forests, completely inside, surrounded by trees, yeah. In Siberia, usually all villages or all settlements on some empty hill, maybe artificial, due to mosquitoes. Mainly due to mosquitoes. It means that between a wall of fire of trees and any house, there is at least 20, 30, 50 meters. It's a bit easier situation. Yes, it's possibility to survive houses. But smoke is really terrible, especially that mainly in Russia, it's so-called ground fires. Ground fires there. Mainly trees are damaged, but not to death, yeah? Anyway, amount of burning materials is not very large, but this burning materials is very wet. Very wet means that it's not full burning with more or less clean air, only hot air, yeah? But just a lot of smoke, a lot of vapor, a lot of particulates, a lot of black carbon. What is really bad, And it covers very large territories, and really damage cities. Last year, I was in South Siberia on the distance of about 400 kilometers from real fires. But anyway, they feel this pollution as well. For health, it's really bad. Yeah, and this is something absolutely compatible with situation near the coal power plants. Coal power plants. It's well known that coal power plants working in your city, at least poor quality coal power plants, decrease your lifetime, potential lifetimes by about 5 years. This is in China and in some cities of Siberia. Forest fires probably reduce your lifetime as well, at least 5 years, maybe even more.
Angelina, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, James. Both of you have mentioned the impacts of climate change on wildfires, on smoke, on other negative events happening in both countries. And I was wondering, what kind of effect does it have on public perception? Would you say that in case of Australia, Will, and in case of Russia, Alexei, public perception is becoming more stronger towards climate change agenda? Do you think that people are really feeling that climate change is there, it's happening, and something should be done about it? Will, maybe if you can start.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. And I think we've had a problem in Australia for a long time because we have such a strong fossil fuel industry. We have some fairly divided politics around these issues. So people tend to be on one side or the other. But what's happened the last few years is that the impacts of climate change have been so drastic, they've been so immediate, they've been in your face, as we say in English. So it's not just the fires, it's been extreme drought in the rural areas for the farmers. It's been the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, which has really hit our tourism industry. So I think there is a shift, and the shift is happening because people who normally weren't too interested or even negative about climate change, like farmers, are changing because they can see it, they can feel it. It's happening to them now. So we have what we call really trusted groups in our society, like farmers, like the emergency management people, the people who fight the fires, the tourism industry. They're all seeing climate change. It's real and it's happening. And that's starting to shift public opinion. So I think there is a much stronger public opinion now for action on climate change. We see it in the polls. We see it in pressure on politicians and so on to start moving on climate change.
Alexei, you've mentioned that some of this has also been reflected in case of Russia, and you also said that even common people these days speak about climate change. But what do you say, like in general public and also maybe in political discourse, are there also changes to be seen?
Yeah, I see some change, and I see at least two types of dynamic. Yeah, first is just usual people on the street, on small cities or even villages in rural areas. So about 15, 20 years ago, people objected existence of climate change or doubted about that. Now they see climate change exists, no doubts. About 10 years ago, many people, probably majority, thought that climate change is good or global warming is good for so-called country as Russia. Now they recognize completely that it's mainly or dominantly negative. Next threshold is reasons. So people try to object man-made impact, and till now older generation in the government or in the street like to insist that it's mainly natural, or it was in the past. Yes, it was in dinosaurs time, but it doesn't matter for us. Yes, younger generation or middle-aged generation, middle age is, I mean, 40 plus minus what is younger generation in government, they understood all. They clearly now real reasons. So it's good progress. On the other hand, then they speak about forest fires or maybe floods in cities. There some streets are flooded and some, several dozens of cars are lost, or some floods. Yeah, they mainly do not blame climate change as a whole. They blame local authorities or local non-responsible business. So they do not link this damage, this risk and growing risk with greenhouse gas emissions as a whole. they mainly link it to just non-responsible business or wrong steps of authorities or poor infrastructure, everything except GHG emissions. Yeah, so they are still not in the way of GHG emission reduction. Of course, the better part of society, most educated people, students, they try to do the best, of course, but in my estimation, it's still small percentage of Russian society, maybe 20%, something like that.
Thank you, Alexei and Will. James, I'm passing it back to you.
All right, so something that's quite interesting about both countries is that both place a large emphasis on fossil fuel exports. And I'm curious how that's shaped debates around climate change policies in both countries. Well, I might start with you because, you know, Australia, we talk endlessly about coal exports, but something that's really interesting is that as we move to recover our economy after the pandemic, we're looking towards gas. So how is that shaped the conversations around climate change here?
Yeah, look, I think that's been an absolutely dominant factor in terms of action, or I should say lack of action on climate change. And there have been some good books written about how the politics has been skewed or poisoned by the big fossil fuel industries. And you're right, for a long time it's been coal. Traditionally, Australia's had mainly coal-fired power stations for electricity. They're being phased out now. But we also have a very big coal export industry. So that's still there. It's still a worry. But as you say, it's dropped a little bit into the background because of the very rapid expansion of the gas industry. And there are two issues here, and that's exporting of LNG or liquefied natural gas, but also domestic gas. And I think the real flashpoint now is as we come out of COVID-19 and start to revamp our economy, we really have an opportunity to remake the electricity system. A lot of the coal-fired generators are old. They're going to be phased out. Renewables are coming on very strongly. They're cost competitive. They're clean. They generate more employment. People really like them. So there's a real push to move strongly. So now there's a real tension with a lot of state governments and local governments wanting to go renewable, but the federal government wants to support gas, and they're pushing a big expansion of the gas industry, even though technology and economics is passing it by. So we have a real tension, a real fight over the next year or two about whether we stop the expansion of the gas industry or whether we get it shoved down our throat by the industry and the federal government.
Alexei, tell us about the situation in Russia and the emphasis on fossil fuel exports and reliance on them.
And again, remembering the past situation, maybe 20 or even 30 years ago, in that time, authorities and just usual people thought that limitation of amount of oil, gas, or coal is the main factor, limitation. And it was calculated that time that there are limited amount of gas and oil underground, maybe for 20 years, maybe for 30 years, but unlimited of coal. Therefore, perception was they are moving from oil and gas to coal. Now situation is absolutely different, opposite. And people understand that coal, oil, and even gas will be interrupted in use, not due to limitation of itself, but, or maybe limitation by price, but due to climate, due to measures which global society will undertake. It's positive. However, they delay it for quite far future. There are many mentioning of this problem in strategic document of Russian government, or in speeches, or in speaking of people, or even scientists, economists, but they speak at least by 2040 all will be the same, at least, or maybe 2050, or maybe 2060. So it's not right now, it's not for short-term business plan. You know that in extraction of hydrocarbons and even rich coal, it could be very profitable, even if your business plan for 5 years. even 5 years or 10 years, it's already very good. You extract gas, liquid it, or transport through tube to China or to Europe, and all is okay. The same about coal. If you have already good railroad infrastructure, marine infrastructure, yeah. So for short-term thinking, all looks good for them, yeah. One more very crucial detail of Russian specific, that coal is private. Coal is private. Therefore, government only look on coal. Oh yes, coal is important for social situation in South Siberia or Far East, but it's not our headache as a whole. Gas and oil is big contributor in federal budget because Gazprom, Rosneft, or almost all others, largest companies are half governmental. So dividends of these companies is feeding of state budget. Therefore, they are ready to, and of course, in the given situation, closest friends of our president are top CEO of these companies. It's universal behavior in many countries. Yeah, it's nothing unusual. Yes, therefore, government take care about oil and even more about gas. How to say, advertising or pushing that gas is bridge fuel. Gas is bridge fuel, everything for gas. Yeah, especially for speaking about oil, Russia is not #1 country around the globe, but speaking about gas, so Russia at least in 3 largest gas reserves around the globe. So relying on gas completely. And speaking about people, of course, in large cities, people understand that they have to disappear from coal, gas, and even from gas. But in villages, in particular in a rural area where I am now due to COVID already in 4 months, yeah, people like gas very much because tube gas supply in villages is huge step to well-being of people in comparison with fuel wood. It's quite clear. Therefore, gas is a symbol of progress, sort of symbol of progress. However, it's not large-scale gas use, just for heating of houses in rural areas, mainly in rural or small cities, yeah. So situation is a bit specific. However, anyway, I see progress. And maybe one more and last detail, which I'd like to say, that in all largest companies, Rosneft, Gazprom, SOEK, SOAL, Siberian Ural Energy Company or coal companies, they have some young, talent people, or maybe not very young, but extremely well-educated people from Moscow, from London, from other educational centers, which know about climate, everything, absolutely all. Absolutely all. It means that top management have all in absolutely adequate information about climate change and perspectives. However, they play business due to money, only money. Therefore, then they play business for next 10 years. They certainly select coal development. Maybe one more detail that in the past, they tried to economy best coal for best prices. Now they are ready to offer best coal for any price because they understand this coal should be sold now in next 5 years to South Korea, to Japan, to Taiwan, to Vietnam, right now in 10 years, because they know that after 10 years, it will be shrinking, even in Asian market.
What's the conversation around zero carbon or renewable energy like in Russia?
Actually, it's still considered as a myth. Still as a myth.
Very interesting.
Unfortunately, yeah. Yeah, because of how it's possible, what is about airplanes, what's about this thing. People know that renewable energy is quite good in good climate conditions, and they have very good development of renewable wind and solar in South Ural, where we have steep, good wind, no frost or frost, but very dry frost without icing of everything. Yeah, it's quite well in these areas of Orenburg Oblast, Astrakhan Oblast, Ulyanovsk Oblast, but in particular in Arctic, or only very small renewables, or just scientific research, because it still doesn't work. So people some people, or maybe even majority people, even don't understand what is it zero, how zero could be achieved. Zero is a myth, yeah. Anyway, they do agree that parity or equal prices for at least solar and coal-generated electricity is coming. They see that there is already in many countries, around the corner in China, almost parity of prices around China. In Russia, they have very many hydro, about quarter, very many nuclear, it's about quarter of electricity, very cheap gas, because gas demand in our trading partner, I mean China and Europe, is limited. A lot of so-called extra gas for domestic use, and price is very low anyway. Yeah. But however, people understand that equal prices could be maybe in middle of 30s, maybe in 40s, and then they're ready to discuss zero carbon everything, but not now.
Over to you, Angelina.
Thank you, James. Will, you mentioned some of the climate policy actions of the federal government in Australia, saying that they're not very supportive of the renewable sector. I was wondering what else has been happening with regard to the climate policies in Australia recently. We've all heard that you had the carbon tax a few years ago. Now you don't have it. I mean, this is like all over the books, all over the articles. What else is happening on the federal level and also maybe on the regional and state levels?
Yeah, at the federal level, there's still not very much action, and it's very slow. I think there's a sort of very slow recognition that renewables are going to be the future, even at the federal level. But they take measures to protect the fossil fuel industry, coal and gas. It's a different story at the state level, pretty much all over the states now. Certainly where I sit in Canberra, it's a very small jurisdiction called the Australian Capital Territory, but we're already 100% renewable. So we did that in 9 years, and we actually dropped our electricity prices. So that made everyone happy, including the hard-headed economists in the government who didn't like the idea at first. Now they're really enthusiastic, and we've legislated to become totally net zero by 2045. That's transport, industry, we don't have much, but we have some, everything. So we're busy now getting gas out of heating and cooking, going to electric. We're putting in new waste plants to recycle waste and so on. So it's a really progressive place. South Australia is already 50% renewable. That's bigger than us. And other states. So at the state level, you're actually seeing Australia move ahead, I think, quite strongly. But there are tensions because our electricity grid is in southeastern Australia, ultimately is controlled by the federal government because it crosses many state boundaries. They slow things up by not improving the connection, the grid, not improving storage and things like this. And that slows the uptake of renewable energy. So we have this tension in that the federal government is dominated by the fossil fuel industry, by coal and gas. And a few states are too, but many states are moving more quickly on renewables because people want it, it saves them money, and it's cleaner. So it's got all those things going for it. So I think this is a critical 5-year period in our move to deal with climate change. And hopefully we can and tip the whole system toward renewables, even at the federal level.
Does Australia have a long-term low carbon development strategy on the federal level?
No, they don't. They have extremely weak Paris targets. So as you know, all countries, Russia, Australia, are signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement, which means that we should be doing what we can to meet, to go for 1.5 or at least well below 2. And we had a climate change authority, which was a body that had climate scientists on it. And that was during the progressive era of the Labor government when they did have a carbon price. And they actually said Australia should be reducing its emissions. We should be cutting them in half by 2030. But then we have the Conservative government dominated by the fossil fuel industry. They wound that back to only half that much. And furthermore, they're going to propose to use credits from the Kyoto period, which are actually illegal. No other country proposes to do that. It's an accounting trick. It's just moving numbers on a book to say, all right, we're going to meet our Paris targets and we won't reduce emissions virtually at all. So there's a real problem again at the federal level and international level compared to what's actually going on the ground.
Alexei, can you give us a brief outlook? What's the situation like in Russia with the Paris Agreement targets and the low carbon development strategy?
Actually, formally speaking, Russia still has not any NDC, so Paris target. They have only intended NDC, written 5 years ago, and extremely weak, anecdotically weak. Yeah. Now, Russia is going to present to Climate Convention, to Paris Agreement, NDC, and it's still under discussion. However, it is considered as a sort of image-making mechanism on one hand, not as some practical tools. Yeah, and unfortunately, pressure of big business and high carbon business is very high, and therefore they have in government people which would like to see quite ambitious goal, but minority. In particular, advisor of the president on climate issues certainly would like to have more ambitious goal, one another people in government in particular, however not majority. Majority don't want to spoil relations with big business, and they say, okay, if they insist on very weak NDC, they can do that, they can do that. Our point, I mean, WWF, is that anyway, NDC should be more ambitious than previous, than INDC, on some at least symbolic, but maybe quite significant percentage. And currently, working draft of NDC is that it's really more ambitious by from 3 to 8% of 1990 percentage. Looks good, but not for a country like Russia, because as if INDC anecdotically weak and NDC corrected is a bit better, but just weak. Is it progress? Yes, it's progress, but too weak progress, yeah. Speaking about strategy to 2050, we have working draft of the given strategy. What is a big, strange organism? It's not considered as real strategy, it's not plan. It's considered as some sort of image-making paper for around the globe. Therefore, you can make the very good wording, very good wording. But behind the scene, and if you read it more carefully, you see that it's absolutely mythological paper, mythological paper. Yeah. In particular, and formally, bureaucratically, authors had to follow so-called policy of socio-economic development of Russia by the middle of 30s. They have such document. But this document expect GDP growth by 3% in average. In usual scenario, is in how to say, in normal scenario, and about 2% in worst scenario. In reality, they have significantly smaller. They already have significantly smaller. Yeah. So, however, they had to use it, and they calculated jumping on emissions due to this percentage. Then discussed it with some economists and some image making. Some of them expressed a paradoxical idea or paradoxical view that if you have something close to the true or which looks like the true, it's bad. It's bad because you're spoiling the true. But if you have some absolutely mythological and clear for everybody that it will never happen, it's not something bad. It means that due to some, in other reasons, lobbying with business or some bureaucratic framework, it calculated, but it just anecdote, nothing more. It's not serious life. Therefore, it looks like that if you have strategy based on 3% GDP, yeah, the very poor renewable energy development. It's better if you have a real GDP growth, maybe 1%, with again very poor renewable energy. Yeah. However, I would like to highlight only one thing in our draft strategy. This is focused on forests. And this is specially designed, and author of this paper and myself as one of advisors, informal advisor to these people, we see that what is goal of the strategy? Demonstrate to the globe that Russia is on board, is number one. Second, let's educate some people in government, some people in business, what is situation of Russian forest. The situation is really dramatic. And all your benefits from energy efficiency could be completely reduced, completely eliminated by smaller and smaller absorption of CO2 in forests due to clear cuts, due to decomposition, due to forest fires. And they included a lot of very pessimistic information and prognosis about forests in this strategy. This is to educate people in government, in business, and around the globe, to attract the attention of people around the globe that Russian forests are in trouble. Sure, this trouble is absolutely not compatible with trouble in Brazil, in Africa, or in Indonesia. Our situation is crucially better. But anyway, in scale of country with income per capita like Russia, so more or less developed country, yeah, it's really, really bad. So our strategy is not strategy, it's a sort of educational or advertising paper. It's better than nothing. However, we will fight for better and better strategy, undoubtedly.
Will, I wonder,
Yeah.
sorry, if you could comment on, because Australia is slightly unusual among developed nations in that our GDP still grows at around 2%, largely driven by population growth. And the government kind of always uses that as an excuse for that's why our emissions should not come down as fast as other nations. What do you make of that argument?
Well, that's as we say in Australian, that's a furphy, because we can get emissions down really fast despite population growth. I gave the example of Canberra, and we are the second fastest growing city in Australia after Melbourne. So we're now growing a little bit faster than Sydney, a little bit faster than Perth and Adelaide, yet we have cut our emissions on 2005 levels by more than 50% in one decade. And it hasn't hurt our economy at all. We have low unemployment rates and so on. So the story here is that that's an excuse. We could do it nationally as well. We could cut our emissions very rapidly and very deeply with economic gain, social gain, and even with population growth. So I don't think that should be an issue at all. We need to get on with the job. I do want to comment a little bit about Alexei's last comment, because in the late 1990s, I was working on an international research program, and I was going to Siberia every summer. And even back, so I went to Krasnoyarsk, Yakutsk, and Khabarovsk in the Far East, and with Russian foresters who are good friends of mine. And so we were going out into the forest at that time. And even then, you could start to see it in the far north. Some of the trees were tipping a bit, the trees that were growing on permafrost, because even in the late 1990s, the permafrost was melting. So these trees, they put their roots out horizontally on top of the permafrost. And when it melts in the summer, that's where they get their nutrients and their water. But the permafrost is melting faster than the trees can grow their roots down. So in the summertime, they start to tip. Russian colleagues call it drunken forest. And so it was quite interesting that, and there were fires too, and so on. So it's quite interesting that the early warning signs of the vulnerability of Siberia was very clear, even in the late 1990s. That's 20 years ago. And so now, of course, as Alexei was saying, we're seeing it as really developing as a big problem. We saw fires in the forest, but not in the tundra. Now you see fires in the tundra up there. Permafrost is decomposing at faster rates. And for those Australian listeners, they can't believe how much carbon is actually in the Siberian permafrost. It's more than what's in the atmosphere, totally. So there is an enormous amount of carbon stored in the far north. So Russia is going to be a key player, not only in its gas and fossil fuel exports, but also in what happens to Russian ecosystems. Just like in terms of marine ecosystems, Australia is really important with the Great Barrier Reef. So we have some parallels there, even though ours are in tropical waters and yours are in the Arctic Circle. But both of these enormous ecosystems are incredibly vulnerable and already being really changed dramatically by climate change.
Yeah.
Angelina, did you want to respond to that?
Wow, I mean, I'm really impressed that you've been to Russia and you saw so many places in Siberia, and you also mentioned the permafrost melting, which is also a topic highly discussed within the Russian climate discourse, both in the country and on the international level. This is probably a very question for which the answer will not be easy, but Alexei, would you say there are any solutions being discussed to permafrost melting in Russia? Is it something we can stop at all, or is it something inevitable and we'll just have to live with this?
Actually, if we see scenarios, in particular IPCC scenarios, you could see that independently on any scenario, warming and temperatures by the middle of century is the same. So they can do nothing with the next 3 decades. However, if we see end of the century, difference is very large. RCP 8.5, what means 4.5 Celsius degrees global warming by the end of the century, in comparison with 19th century, is really terrible. It's really terrible. In other scenarios, RCP 4.5, what means 2.5 Celsius degrees. It's not goal of the Paris Agreement. It's worse than ecological society appeal, but it looks like something really achievable, at least by climatologists. Therefore, climatologists and specialists in climate like these scenarios very much. These scenarios provide very large difference from the wars, very, very large difference. So they can do a lot. They can do a lot. Sure, they cannot stop permafrost melting it a lot, completely, but they can decelerate it significantly. They can keep it in the same maybe speed. So now in different places in Russia, melting, I mean seasonal summer melting flower depth is from 3 to 15 centimeters per decade, So in some places maybe 10 centimeters, in some places could be 60 centimeters. This difference explains why disasters in one place and troubles like in Norilsk, and why situation is more or less good in other places. Yes, it depends on soil, it depends on ice under the ground, and many things. Yeah, so sure, solution exists, and solution is very simple. Very reduction of global emissions by at least modest scenarios leading to 2.5. 2 degrees, certainly significantly better, yeah. And it is about everything, not only about permafrost melting on ground, but also on shelf, Arctic marine shelf methane hydrates. It's one more very painful thing. Scientists really measure large flux of methane, large flux. They don't know yet, is it growth of this flux? Is it significant growth, or maybe this flux was permanent the last decades? Yeah. However, certainly that methane hydrates volume on the shelf is very large, very large. That warming of water exists in Arctic, and even 1 or 2 Celsius degrees of in water is enough for decomposition of methane hydrates. And again, it depends on scenario, Therefore, they have to use permafrost or methane hydrates or any visible examples, in particular trees, which is not vertical now in summer, yeah, to demonstrate its real effects, its large effect, with growing effect, and effect globally could be really large by the end of the century. But by the end of the century, it can reduce effect by another path of global economy. The Russia is a part, Russian energy is a part, etc., etc., etc. Please go ahead.
James?
I just wanted to ask you both about the business response. And I mean, we know that there are laggards amongst businesses, but are there any companies in either country that are really taking the lead on climate change and what sectors they're in? Will, we might start with you.
The one I think that's a little bit disappointing is transport. We could do a much better job on transport. Again, here in Canberra, we are putting in facilities for electric vehicles. We're electrifying our public transport system and so on. But I think that could be sped up in some of the large capital cities as well. I think we don't have the problem that Russians do in terms of heating our houses. It's mainly cooling our houses is a big issue during summertime. So again, issues like that, electrifying the cooling systems and so on and running them on renewables. In terms of business, it's a real mixed bag. Obviously, you got the big fossil fuel players there who are blocking a lot of things, but you have a lot of innovation underneath that in terms of types of buildings, in terms of transport, obviously in terms of electricity. Very innovative people in the primary industries in Australia. A lot of farmers, particularly the young farmers, who are completely different from the generation before them, who tend to be climate deniers. The young farmers are right on top of the climate change issue, developing new crop varieties, new ways of tillage. The wine industry is adapting extremely quickly to climate change. So we're getting some action with the younger generation coming through the primary industries. That's positive. But again, you've got the big export industries, the big fossil fuel industries. They're extremely powerful politically, and they are the ones that are the blockages. And they have the federal government under their thumb. And so that really is the problem that we face. The way I look at it here in Australia, I think we can reach a tipping point in the next few years. Pressure's building. We're seeing a lot more climate impacts, the reef, the fires, and so on. But I think importantly now, we're seeing economic benefits of switching to renewables, of switching to a clean economy. That's building pressure throughout the economy. And like a lot of the things I work on, which are on tipping points in the climate system, you can get social tipping points. And I think hopefully within the next 4 or 5 years in Australia, we're going to see a tipping point where people just get fed up with the lack of action because they see so many multiple benefits and actually doing the right thing on climate change. So that's my hope for the next few years.
Great. Alexei, I was wondering what the situation is in Russia. Are there innovators in the economy that are really taking steps to, address climate change?
Yes, it's not in large scale, but exists. And speaking strategically, speaking nationally, on next maybe 15 years, there are two main directions. One is energy efficiency, different types, in buildings, in transport, in industry, and forests. So 2 columns. Next, maybe after 15 years, it will be renewable energy, I hope, and wide range of measures to shift Russian economy from raw materials like oil, gas, coal, aluminium, steel to more high technology products. But speaking about visible and current achievements, electricity in transport, electricity everywhere is very visible. Yeah, it was not possible to imagine that somebody in Moscow area will heat house by electricity. It could be extremely expensive. But now there is two things. Firstly, almost passive buildings, very good thermal isolation. And secondly, more flexible policy of government, which have different tariff. It's possible in night tariff could be 3-4 times less than peak tariff in the middle of the day. Yeah, it's good for loading of power plants. Yes, and therefore for efficiency of electricity generation. So they both. Therefore, such flexible tariff is really contribute to efficiency of generation and efficiency of consumption. So it's good. Yeah, another thing is electric transport or gas transport. Government and Gazprom, of course, promote gas transport as much as possible. I don't think that it could be very large, but in some one and other areas, it could be large due to due to economic reasons, first of all, and clean air, of course. Gazprom or local branch of Gazprom in some cities even ready to supply equipment for car free of charge. Of course, it will be 0% rent of this equipment, not gift from the government to a person, yes. But anyway, it will be free, yeah. And price of gas in comparison with petrol is about 2 times cheaper, so a real perspective. Electricity is more profitable in transportation. It's work more or less good, not only in Moscow and larger cities. So electric buses, one direction. And of course, they see on street electric bicycles, small and large, and people of different generation, not only young generation, use it. So it's very, very visible. Sure, it's maybe electric bicycles is very small contribution in GHG emissions, but very large contribution in perception of problem in mind of people. Yeah, very visible, yeah. Sure, the traffic police would like to introduce a lot of restrictions because electric bicycles is already a sort of transport, but rules for them is so-called very flexible, very absolutely, how to say, out of any rules. They can cross any street in any direction, yes. However, it's already a local problem, could be sorted out, of course. However, progress is not bad. Progress is not bad. Houses, transport, even industry production. However, it's bad is that trend is too slow. It's certainly possible to make a trend 3 times faster. However, business conditions or some inertia or even maybe some corruption somewhere is decelerators. And there we have trend, not bad trend, but we certainly see that it could be 3 times more.
Thanks, Alexei. Angelina, we probably have time for one last question.
Right. Thank you, James. Well, hearing you both speak, I see a lot of similarities between the 2 countries. And I believe that was also one of the reasons why we decided to have the talk and also maybe show the audiences in both countries that even another large country at the other end of the globe can have completely similar climate issues, problems with fossil fuel lobby, issues with federal governance, issues with public perception, negative consequences of climate change. So my question is, after you heard each other speak, would you think of any kind of cooperation between the 2 countries, which can be done on any level, scientific level, civil society level, other levels you can think of? What comes to your mind? Will?
Well, I think one thing that we share is the gas issue. And I think perhaps we can learn a bit from Russia, where it's been a big industry for a long time and a difficult one to deal with. I know Alexei's been talking about how you can get free gas equipment for your car. Big export industry. When I was living in Sweden, the big issue was the Russian pipeline coming down the Baltic Sea to ship gas into Europe. Very controversial issue in Sweden. So we know how the big fossil fuel industries drive things. So we have exactly the same issue in Australia now with the real push for the gas industry. So I think those of us who are working in the climate change space, if we can share some knowledge about how we try to deal with this big push for fossil fuels, how do we try to turn this around, undermine and so on, that would be extremely useful. I think also in extreme events that are hitting our countries in terms of extreme heat, be it the Arctic or down here in Australia, adaptation measures may be also something we can talk about. But I think there is a lot we can share in terms of dealing with both the impacts of climate change and trying to get emissions down.
Alexei?
Yeah, I also see that they have many beneficial points or even tracks when we cooperate just with Australia. Because you know that Russians like to compare Russia with Europe, Usually Russians are outsiders, they are disappointed, they try to explain European behavior by absence of energy sources, by some special mentality, many reasons. So a comparison and use of European experience is not the best to push Russian perception, Russian behavior. The same about China. China is another style of life, another discipline, is another world. United States is also terrible. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. However, Australia looks like very good example because also a lot of energy resources. Yeah, and especially then they cooperate and jointly communicate about perception of people and perception of small and middle-sized business.
Yeah.
Large business, the oligarchs, they have a lot of money, they more take care about good relations with presidents and politicians. But small and middle-sized business, crucially more flexible. And they have not advisors which are brilliant at climate change. They have nobody. They work themselves. Yeah. Therefore, I see at least two areas: cooperation on level of public perception and communication and NGOs, and small and middle-sized business. First of all, most progressive one.
Great.
Thank you, James. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And thank you so much for both of you for joining us this evening. It's been really fascinating to hear about the similarities and differences and the things that we can learn from each other. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.